the room. We're all very excited to dig into the new budget. Welcome to the first hearing of the Committee on Budget and Fiscal Review. I'm pleased to be joined by our returning Vice Chair, Senator Jim Nielsen. We want to welcome new committee members to the Budget Fiscal Review Committee and also to welcome returning members as well. We will be hearing a presentation from the Department of Finance. We'll also be hearing from our Legislative Analyst Office as well. And then just for a suggested format, colleagues, that we would review first our revenue. We often spend a lot more time on our expenditure side of the ledger as opposed to the revenue, get a sense of revenue. Also put the following discussion in a frame of some historical consideration. Where have we been with regard to investments in different issue areas over the past couple of decades? Where are we today? Of course, recognizing also the governor's main focus on attending to paying down the wall of debt, attending to unfunded liabilities, and making sure our budget stays balanced in the out years. So with that, I'm going to ask Ms. Keely Bosler to join us and give the presentation from the Department of Finance. Welcome back.
Good morning, Senator Leno and the members of the committee. Keely Bosler with the Department of Finance, and it's my pleasure to be here to present the overview of the 2015-16 governor's budget. This budget makes major investments in education. It does continue to pay down the state's debts and liabilities that accumulated, especially over the past decade, and then also saves for a rainy day, thanks to Proposition 2 passed by the voters this past November. The budget is $113.3 billion general fund. This is an increase of 1.4% over the revised current year levels. The budget is balanced. It provides for a $534 million operating reserve or special fund for economic uncertainties, and also puts aside $2.8 billion in the new Proposition 2 rainy day fund. While the budget is balanced, and it is balanced over the forecast period through 2018-19, it is balanced only precariously. And this is really due to two main factors. The first being that Proposition 30 was temporary in nature, and those revenues start to trigger off over the forecast period, starting in 2016 with the sales tax. The second issue is that we do have some growing expenditures over the forecast period. The most notable one is that the state will start to take on a share of costs of the optional Medi-Cal expansion that the state implemented 2 years ago, and those costs will grow to over $1 billion over the forecast period. But I'm happy to report today that California's economy continues to be strong and growing, and with that, state revenues have also increased. Since the 2014 Budget Act was enacted last summer, revenues are up $4 billion over the 3-year period. And they're up $2.5 billion just in the current year, really following on the very strong performance in the stock market at the end of the 2014 calendar year. But with these increased revenues in the current year, we also have significant increased expenditures on the Proposition 98 guarantee. So $2.5 billion in additional revenues in the current year, and nearly $2.3 billion in additional expenditures related to Proposition 98 just in the current year. Also, since the 2014 Budget Act was enacted, we've also seen some increased costs in some of our programs, most notably Medi-Cal. Enrollment continues to increase, as well as costs in those programs also have been increasing. In the 2015-16 budget year, we estimate that over 12 million Californians will be enrolled in the Medi-Cal program, which is nearly 1/3 of the state's total population. Also, since last summer, we've had major fires across the state due to the severe drought that California continues to face, and firefighting costs are up nearly $500 million as well. There are many risks also that are to the state's budget that are not built in at this point. One of them has to do with the major announcement that the president made late in 2014 related to immigration. The administration continues to evaluate the impacts of those announcements and regulations to follow and how those may impact the state's major entitlement programs. There's also always a threat of recession. The state and our current economic forecasts do not predict a recession, but we are already 9 months past the average length of an economic expansion in the post-World War II era, which is 5 years. So this does continue to be a threat, and recent news about international forecasts being revised downward is always something that is of concern to us as well. And then finally, the state has many long-term liabilities that have accumulated over the decades. If you turn to the next slide, there's a listing of those liabilities. The state's outstanding liabilities are a number over $226 billion. And really, if left unaddressed, these liabilities will continue to have a larger and larger call on the state's budget. So that also continues to be a risk to the state's budget. And this is a listing of the debts and liabilities eligible for repayment over the next 15 years due to Proposition 2. As I mentioned, Proposition 2 was passed by the voters this past November and does require annual deposits into a new rainy day fund of 1.5% of annual general fund revenues, as well as those spiking capital gains revenues as well. And this year, $2.4 billion is deposited and $1.2 billion is available to pay down the state's debts, and the other $1.2 billion is deposited in the rainy day fund per the calculations in the Constitution. But the big story of this budget is really the investments that Proposition 30 is enabling the state to make in education. Over the past 4 years, education funding has increased by 39% to a record Proposition 98 level of $65.7 billion in the budget year. Since 2011-12, this reflects a $2,600 increase per pupil for our K-12 schools. The budget pays off all of the remaining K-14 deferrals, which is nearly $1 billion. These were the budget balancing tool that was used over the recession. The budget also makes a $4 billion investment in the local control funding formula. $1.1 billion in one-time monies are allocated to continue the implementation of the Common Core standards. $500 million is proposed to implement a new adult education block grant, and $250 million is provided for a 3-year incentive career technical education incentive grant program. The budget also continues to invest in higher education by providing nearly $1 billion in new monies for the community college system. It also continues the multi-year funding plan for UC and CSU that was started 2 years ago by providing 4% growth in this upcoming budget year, which translates to $120 million for each segment. This money is provided as long as the segments hold tuition flat for all students, and the administration continues to take a very close focus on cost containment and reducing the time it takes students to get to their degrees. Addressing poverty and income inequality in the state is one of the bigger challenges facing the state today. And in partnership with the legislature, the administration has taken many actions, several actions over the past 2 years to try and reduce income inequality and address poverty issues. The first is the action that the state took 2 years ago to implement health care reform. The optional expansion especially expanded coverage to millions of Californians, many of which who had never had access to regular health insurance and health coverage, health care. This action to do both the mandatory and optional expansion of healthcare reform has resulted in $16.3 billion in additional expenditures on the Medi-Cal program over the last 2 years. And while a small portion of that is general fund, about $1 billion, those costs are growing, as I mentioned earlier, over the forecast period. Also, in the budget year, we will have allocated $10.8 billion through the new local control funding formula, which is really a landmark new way of allocating our base school resources to those schools that are most impacted by poverty, by allocating the monies based on the number of students from low-income families, the number of English language learners, and the number of foster youth that are in the school districts. Over the last 2 years, the state has increased the minimum wage by 25% and has also, just this last year, in partnership with the legislature, extended sick leave to 6.5 million workers. Also, over the last 2 years, the budget has contained monies to increase the grants to CalWORKs recipients by 10%. In this budget, we provide, the administration has put forth a new proposal to provide a coordinated workforce development system and $1.2 billion to fund that system. The workforce development proposals include the $500 million related to adult education, where we propose a allocation board based on the 70 local consortia that were built over the last 2 years between K-12 school districts and community college districts. And we propose to further integrate these allocation boards and planning boards with county social services agencies, as well as correctional rehabilitation entities in the county. Also, additional investments in career technical education at both K-12 schools and community colleges, and an infusion of $29 million to really expand the number of apprenticeships that are available across the state, including expanding the apprenticeship programs to new and emerging industries in California. This budget also strengthens our infrastructure. The voters passed Proposition 1 this past November, and $533 million of these new bond monies are proposed to be allocated in the budget to implement the Water Action Plan, which was a document that is a comprehensive roadmap for the state's water infrastructure that was released by the administration a year ago. The Water Action Plan has 3 major components. First, to restore our native habitats and native landscapes, also to make more resilient our water management infrastructure, and also to improve the reliability of water supplies for our agricultural industry as well as our urban consumers. There's $1.1 billion in bond monies to address critical flood management issues. And there's also $1 billion from cap and trade revenues to continue the investments that were established last year, including 25% of those revenues being allocated to the high-speed rail project, 20% to sustainable communities, including half of those monies in sustainable communities dedicated to affordable housing, 10% to transit, or 15% to transit and rail, and then the remaining 40% for other important strategies to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make the state's environment more resilient to climate change. $125 million is put forth in this budget for critical deferred maintenance on state facilities, including a $25 million allocation to UC, another $25 million allocation to CSU, and the remaining $75 million to many of our critical infrastructures that are deteriorating across the state, including corrections in the state parks. The deferred maintenance is a mounting issue for the state. The amount is around $66 billion. Of that $66 billion, about $59 billion is really attributable to our state roads and our critical trade corridors. And this budget, we want to continue to work with the legislature and with stakeholders to work towards ongoing and expanding funding sources for state highways and the freight corridors, because we see these as really issues that need to be addressed and are a long-term liability for the state. The budget also continues to pay down our debts and address long-term liabilities, as I mentioned already, $1.2 billion related to Proposition 2 required debt payments. The budget also pays down all the remaining school deferrals and also makes a $533 million payment to local mandate reimbursements. Both the school deferrals and the local mandate reimbursements are related to a trigger that was in the budget in the last budget that was enacted that was tied to additional revenues. If additional revenues came in above the 2014 Budget Act, they would be used first to pay down these debts. And so our estimates as of the January 10 budget is that $533 million will be available to pay local governments, cities and counties for mandate debt that's owed to them from before 2004. The budget also makes the final payment on the $15 billion of economic recovery bonds that were taken out to cover deficits from as far back as 2002. And then finally, the plan has we put forth a plan to eliminate the retiree healthcare unfunded liability. In 2012, in partnership with the legislature, the governor signed the Public Employees Pension Reform Act to increase cost sharing for employees and extend retirement ages. And just last year, in partnership with the legislature, a new funding plan was put forth for the state teachers' retirement system. And this year, we really wanted to turn our attention to the remaining unfunded liability that needs to be addressed. And this is the $72 billion retiree health benefit. If you look at the final slide that I've put in this packet, you will see that if no action is taken, this liability will continue to grow, and over the next several decades will grow to over $300 billion, taking more and more of the state's general fund to pay for this liability. But under the plan that we've put forward, the hope is that we can really reverse that trend. And we're putting forward a multi-pronged effort. The first prong of that effort is a pre-funding strategy that calls for employees and the state to share 50-50 the cost sharing of a pre-funding of retiree health, and we hope to accomplish that at the bargaining table as the contracts come up for renewal. Second, we're also want to work with the legislature to really preserve this very important and valuable benefit for career workers by extending the vesting period from 10 to 20 years to 15 to 25 years. And then finally, also in working with collaboration with CalPERS, we want to work on really reducing the cost structure of all employee health benefits by offering high-deductible health plans and health savings accounts and other actions that can really help to reduce the long-term healthcare costs, which have also been a burden to employees who have seen their premiums double over the past decade. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bosler, for the concise, though comprehensive overview of the budget. We're going to call the roll, and then Senator Nielsen wants to make a brief statement. I'm going to suggest that we hear from Mr. Taylor of the Legislative Analyst's Office after that, hold our questions. We'll have a little more that we can discuss. And I assure and promise every committee member that all questions will be heard. There's time for everything. I'm here as long as anyone else wants to be here. So call the roll, please.
Senators Lindo?
Here.
Nielsen? Here. Allen? Anderson? Here. Bell? Here. Block? Hancock? Here. Mitchell? Here. Mawning? Here. Morrell? Here. Wynn? Here. Pan? Here. Pabley? Here. Roth? Here. Stone? Here. Wolk? Here. We have.
Thank you. Senator Nielsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to be again working with you and the members of this committee. I will argue that this is the hardest working committee in the legislature. And I will also argue it is the most important committee in the legislature. The decisions that we make have such a direct and enormous impact on the people of the state of California. So it is a rather heavy responsibility and burden on us. I appreciate the help from Ms. Keeley and her excellent presentations all the time, and my friend Mr. Taylor. And by the way, I keep reminding you, in this room, we have 2 people from Sanger. So these little small valley towns can produce people that come in high places and are at least reasonably successful. This is a budget where we find ourselves in much agreement with the governor. We agree with him, and I believe the ledge analyst does, that it's precariously balanced. And we are the ones who deal with that precariousness, whether we aggravate or make it better. So we have a big burden and responsibility. It's argued, and I think in good faith, that the rainy day fund is not enough. And I'll give a little history. The rainy day fund was originally called the Fund for Economic Uncertainties, those unforeseen situations, as mentioned, the fires, the floods, the earthquakes. They've never anticipated that they would be to fund ongoing programs. We've got to keep that in mind. And this is about protecting the people. And one of the overgirding, I think, responsibilities of this members of the committee is what I call keeping faith with the citizens of California. Keeping faith because this is the committee that deals with the accountability of the agencies, how they work, how they spend the money that the legislature and the governor allocate to them. And our oversight responsibility, and the governor has focused on it again and again, as has a new pro tem Senator De Leon. We need to do that, and we're the ones that have that primary authority and responsibility. We have got to continue and expand our efforts on the debt, retirement of debt, and the governor is indeed focused on that. As to Proposition 30, I think this is another keep faith with the voters. They have been promised way before even Prop 30 passed and former increases that everything was going to be temporary. And temporary doesn't even apply. Well, we need to make sure it applies. It's incumbent on us as we build our budgets the next couple of years to keep in mind that tax is going to go away. Now, it doesn't mean the world's going to fall off, we're going to fall off the world and everything's going to shut down. There's going to be a big problem. We can plan for that eventuality and find the efficiencies in the funding to not just disastrously cut programs when that tax extinguishes. And it is our position that that tax should extinguish. We do want to address that debt. As to UCCSU and the community colleges, we all agree that they are deserving of more funding, but not without accountability. And we endorse the governor's ideas, and we have some of our own about what that accountability should look at. I'm glad the governor and President Napolitano are sitting down and examining some of these areas. It needs to be done at the CSU level, and even as well to a lesser degree at the community colleges. Infrastructure is critical, and the governor has focused on that. The voters have spoken on that with the passage of Proposition 1. And we need to get about these projects, not delaying them for literally decades. And very particularly, that includes the storage, the surface impoundments, and the groundwater replenishment that Prop 1 does provide for. We need to address the needs of our roads and streets and our state highways. And there are ways to do that, and there are funds to do that without raising taxes. We need to examine those not raised taxes ways to accomplish it. And I would argue that there's plenty of funding around to do that. But this is an infrastructure that has far too long been neglected. We seek the repeal of an onerous and very fiscally irresponsible provision that was slipped in a year ago that discourages fiscal responsibility of local school districts as related to their accrued reserves. That area warrants a lot of attention. That issue, it warrants a repeal. In terms of Medi-Cal, we talk about expansion. I will argue that before we expand, we need to examine what we are now providing in terms of Medi-Cal to the individuals, people who are on Medi-Cal and receiving help and benefits, and the providers there too, including our doctors. I want to say how much I endorse the progress made with CalWorks And that's something very dear to me because I was a part of the creation of its predecessor, the GAIN program. And I tell you, folks, every day, including a marvelous experience up in Oroville in December, seeing people participating in the CalWorks program and seeing the hope in their eyes because of it. There are things that we do in welfare that work. Much does not, but that is one that has for a long time. Winding down, I want to thank the governor also for his focus on mandates. That has been around forever. Unfunded and oppressive mandates imposed, and the governor's trying to get about addressing those mandates. And in terms of realignment, I'm going to introduce the bill again with the co-authorship or joint authorship of Senator Hancock to get us some data from the counties. And in this budget, we're requesting some provision of funds for the counties to be able to provide us that necessary information. Mr. Chairman, thank you for a moment or two to give a bit of an overview. I look forward to now more testimony and comments from our members and questions.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. To announce, we'll be having our next full budget committee hearing on Thursday, February 12th. And that is the day before our Friday session for the President's holiday weekend. And then another one on February 26th. We'll get all this information to your offices. And then there'll be another one probably the first week in March, date yet to be determined. So we're planning at least 3 additional full budget committee hearings.